I just really have to know
Yes, you did. Because I was looking for his friend's book too.
Yeah.
It's under L. Here, couldn't find it. All apart.
Okay, greetings everyone, and thank you for coming out tonight. Already messing up the live stream. Sorry, everyone. My name is Shady Rose. I'm the events manager here at Lost City Books. I'm very pleased to have you. And we're very excited to be presenting City of Incurable Women by Maud Casey today. A few housekeeping items before we begin. For those of you who are brand new here, we are Lost City Books, a used, new, and rare bookstore. And we've been occupying this space for about 4 years, but this building has been a bookstore for over 40 years. So we're continuing a long legacy and love of books, and you all are a part of that. Please silence your cell phones now so that out of respect to our speakers, we can keep a nice quiet room, because believe me, that does carry. We will have time for a Q&A at the end of the talk. So if you have any questions or comments, please hold them until that time. You'll know when. Lastly, our speakers are able to remove their masks at the table, but please keep yours on for the safety of everyone here. If you purchased your book ahead of time on the Eventbrite ticket link, that's going to be held under your name downstairs at the front desk. If you have not gotten your book yet, we have some here, which you may be allowed to get signed later. As also at the end of this event, we will have a little time to sort of mingle and chat. You can get your book signed, talk with each other, talk with our speakers this evening. And I think there are a few little treats back that way in the form of red wine. If you would like to drink some of that, please be an adult if you do. No wine for babies. Without further ado, I'm so pleased to welcome Maud Casey and Emily Mitchell discussing City of Incurable Women.
So should we just leave the mics here, or
I would grab them.
we can grab them?
Yeah.
Okay.
Hello.
All right. Well, first, I just want to say thank you to Shady Rose and to Lost City Books for welcoming me and my city into your city. And thank you to all you lovely humans for emerging from your cocoons and entering into the strange world of the flesh. It means a lot to have you all here. And thank you to Emily, generous friend, wonderful writer, wonderful colleague, who has agreed to speak to me about this creation of mine. So I'm gonna talk just a little bit about how the book came into being, and then I'm going to read a few pieces, and then Emily and I will chat, and then we'll open it up for questions. So I used to say that I was a glacially slow writer who had to allow herself to be really stupid for a long time, particularly in relation to historical events and historical material. And I'm trying to find a different, kind of less punishing way of expressing this, since material has to find its form, and it takes as long as it takes. So I've decided to start saying that I'm a very deliberate writer who likes to take wild digressions into historical research and spend a lot of time looking out of windows. So this book, and I called it a book because, I mean, it's kind of a novel, it's kind of linked stories, it's just a book is how I'm thinking of it. And it's an assemblage of short fictional pieces, archival photographs, excerpts from case histories, both real and partly invented. And it began really, I mean, to go way, way back, in the late 80s when I was in college, and encountered a book by Georges Didi Huberman, who wrote a book called The Invention of Hysteria. And this book was about the link between the invention of that diagnosis by Jean-Martin Charcot, who was a renowned neurologist in the mid-19th century, who did lots of really good things, like lasting things. And then he took this detour into hysteria. And it's the link between that diagnosis and photography, particularly medical and forensic photography. And so included in Huberman's book were these archival photographs of these young women and girls. And I keep saying women and girls, and I feel like I really need to, because a lot of the girls who washed up on the shores of the Salpêtrière were 13, 14. So there were these archival photographs, and what struck me was how staged and still the subjects of the photographs were, and how staged and still these women, these girls were when they were in the throes of a disease that caused a lot of shaking and contortions. And so because 19th century photography was, it was glass plates, it was photographic glass plates, and it required time for the images to form. This meant that the patients, the subjects, were required to hold their poses. So this performative aspect, this performative quality, which Charcot really cultivated in these clinical demonstrations that he did on a weekly basis called the Tuesday lessons. And at these clinical lectures and demonstrations, there would be a patient there for him to kind of illustrate the case. And at first, the audience for the Tuesday lessons was largely medical students, and slowly but surely it became a kind of spectacle that everybody wanted to attend. So William James showed up, Edgar Degas showed up, a lot of like society ladies showed up. But the question, in addition, I'm sorry, I have a cough drop. I have some allergies, so coughing during COVID is not great, so I'm trying to prevent that. The question that persisted, in addition to the performative nature of these photographs, was what was going on beyond the frame, what was going on outside the frame, and so this led me 3 decades later, when the question was still kind of floating around in my head, to a collaboration with a photographer whose name is Laura Larson. And together we visited the archives, and we conducted a book club of 2 in which we read a lot of John Berger's essays on photographs and a lot of other stuff. And eventually our collaboration turned into 2 books, and her City of Incurable Women is forthcoming from St. Lucy's Press. So my book went on from there, and it's intentionally fragmented with a kind of kaleidoscopic shifting perspective. And there's sections in first person point of view, second person, third person, and there is a collective we. And I wanted the reader to feel a little bit unsettled, but even more than that, I wanted to feel a little unsettled in relation to the material. And I think this had to do with the fact that my aim was never to speak on behalf or for these women and girls. They're long gone. That was not going to happen. What I wanted was a kind of impossible meditation across the centuries, and one that respected the mystery of these people who have so often been defined by what was done to them. And their circumstances were often wretched. There's no getting around that. But my hope is that what I've created is something that kind of unfixes some of the fixing the doctors were doing, by which I mean fixing through diagnosing, fixing through photography, through kind of these frozen images, as if it were possible to ever capture a self. And actually the writer Cristina Rivera Garza, who recently visited the University of Maryland, we were really lucky to have her come to our Zoom room, makes the really wonderful distinction between historical fiction in which facts are melted into a story and documentary fiction in which archival material creates detours and is kind of presented as archival material. And when I read this distinction really helped me a lot in thinking about what I think I've done or what I'm hoping to have done. I think most importantly to me, these women, these girls, they eluded the doctors, and they elude me too. And I'm really hoping to kind of feature that in the work. So I'm going to read some bits and pieces from different sections, which I hope will give you a sense of the whole. So I'm not going to read a complete story. I'm going to read a kind of patchwork. And I'll explain just a few things before I launch in. One is that of the pieces I'm going to read, they'll include, there's a first person thread that runs through the book that is inspired in part by Blanche Marie Whitman, who was one of the celebrated hysterics, who appears in a painting called A Clinical Lesson at the Salpêtrière, which is reproduced in the book. In which she appears to be sort of fainting in Charcot's arms, surrounded by male medical students. Then there's also a collective we, as I mentioned, and this is something I arrived at when Laura and I went to the Countway Medical Library, where there's a cache of these glass photographic. Hang on, I wrote it down. For this very reason, a cache of glass plate negatives from the Salpêtrière. And so what was light was dark, what was dark was light. They're kind of spectral, they're beautiful, they're heartbreaking. None of these photographs were photographs of the celebrated hysterics, women and girls who were diagnosed with hysteria. These were like intake photographs. And so these were the photographs that were taken when the women showed up. And so there, Laura and I were in the basement, wearing our little gloves, holding these crumbling glass plates. And photography is made of light. And so, I felt I was holding the light that had been in the same room with these women. And I think it was around that time that I thought, I wanna find a way to kind of meditate across the centuries toward this anonymous group of women. And I think, they were not all the same, but what they had in common was pretty dire poverty and often abuse at the hands of their employers. And as I imagine it in the book, they formed a kind of community. There was community there. The other thing that is sort of interesting to know that appears in some of the pieces that I'm about to read is that Charcot's last words were allegedly, "I'm feeling a little better now," which I've always loved. I didn't make that part up. Okay, so hang on. So the first thing I'm going to read is the prologue. The hospital has always been a museum full of dead things, anatomical drawings, a cabinet full of skulls and spinal columns, entire skeletons, plaster casts of our bodies, endless photographs of us, this girl making this shape, that girl making another, clenched toes, a hand cupping the dark. Are the photographs dead too? I float outside the frame, not dead at all. It is true there are things I would prefer not to discuss. For example, all the things you want to know. The spells and lethargic states, I could not do otherwise. Besides, it was not a bit of fun. Simulation, lots of fakes tried. The great doctor gave them one look and said, "Be still." I float outside the frame, not still at all. What difference does it make? I lie all day long, here where there are no days. I was born to go nowhere, but I'm everywhere. The child of the sounding sea, that glittering vision of the infinite, always and forever offering itself up. I offer myself up. I would say the sea was generous, that I was, but that is beside the point. I am beside the point, right beside it. I am not abandoned, only unfortunate. And some days I'm not even unfortunate. Other days I just float. Once, for example, in a long gone winter, not gone at all, I stood on a jetty. The rain fell on the surface of the ocean, and that was all. This next short section is from a section called The City Itself, and scattered throughout the book are often epigraphs from some of the doctors, and this epigraph is from Jean-Martin Charcot himself. The Great Asylum, as you are all surely aware, contains a population of over 5,000 people, including a great number called incurables, who are admitted for life. In other words, we are in possession of a kind of living pathological museum, the resources of which are considerable. The city is in many ways like other cities. Like other cities, it was built alongside a river and has a series of low, rambling buildings, at the center of which is the domed chapel of a cruciform church. In the chapel, Chapelle Saint-Louis, the great doctor will one day lie in state. We will be invited to pass through to look upon his dead face. Those of us who can't walk will be brought on stretchers. From a stretcher, it will be harder to look upon his dead face, but they will tell us that to see his face is not the point, though we will have had enough of the point by then because we have had enough of the point already. Not pointed at all, but dull and dusty, left somewhere on the side of the road as we were walking to where, who can even remember? Still, who wouldn't look? We will look as he looked, seeking out the disease. Did you leave this world gently? Our mothers and fathers wish until it wasn't, because they could not find gentleness in the world. And so why would leaving be any different? Anyway, who leaves this world gently? We will look the way we all look when studying a face that has studied us. Who are you? Who am I? Where are we going? What is this feeling inside of me? Why? What does it all mean? Etc. His last words, I am feeling a little better. How about now? There's also a third person strand that runs through the book that's inspired by Louise Augustine Gleiss, who was known as Augustine. And she arrived at the Salpêtrière when she was about 14, and she was celebrated and photographed by Charcot. And then the last that is kind of in the historical record that we know about her is that she escaped in men's clothing stolen from an intern from the Salpêtrière, and then nobody seems to have bothered to have found out whether she lived or died. And this creates an enormously wonderful possibility for fiction writers. In real life, in 1928, the surrealist André Breton, who actually was a doctor at the Salpêtrière for a time, published a celebration of the 50th anniversary of the diagnosis of hysteria in their journal and reproduced the photographs that Charcot had taken of Augustine as a young girl. And I wondered, this was one of the early pieces that I wrote, I sort of wondered, well, 50 years later, maybe she was alive and in her late 60s, and maybe someone handed her the journal. And then what would she think about it? So that's where this selection comes from. It comes from a story called 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. Once, when Augustine was still the doctor's best girl, he left her alone in his office. Who wouldn't have looked at the papers on his desk? Report on the service of the insane of the Department of the Seine in the year 1877. One doctor for every 500 patients. 3 different kinds of diets, 2 meals, 1 meal, and starvation. The rate of cure, 9.72%. According to the report, 254 women died that year of causes due to insanity. 38 physical causes such as scrofula, blows, wounds, alcohol, debauchery, licentiousness, and masturbation. 21 moral causes such as nostalgia, misery, love, joy, and bad reading habits. Her world is without color, the doctor had said, but there's color still. And this is a small section from the Surrealist Manifesto. We proposed, therefore, in 1928, a new definition of hysteria. Hysteria is a more or less irreducible mental state. The mental state is founded on the need for a reciprocal seduction, which explains the hastily accepted miracles of medical suggestion. Hysteria is not a pathological phenomenon and can, in all respects, be considered as a supreme means of expression. Augustine puts another log on the fire. She puts the journal on the fire. She returns to her novel about the mysterious sea creature, which eventually turns out to be the submarine. As the journal burns, the submarine takes the men around the world, 20,000 leagues, to the Antarctic ice shelves, to the corals of the Red Sea, to Atlantis. The captain is monomaniacal, and ultimately, having abandoned his crew, he disappears into a maelstrom off the coast of Normandy. She understands Captain Nemo's desire for exile, but she is not Nemo. She is not nobody. Her favorite is the scene when the giant squid attacks one of the crew. She's read it over and over. Tonight, as often happened when she was the girl in the photographs, her mind delights her with its inventiveness. In her own one-person submersible, she sinks into the ocean, black as the night in those pictures where she floated. But here, there is no frame. The liquid world goes on forever. There, in the expansive underwater night, she meets the giant squid. It presses its eye to the window of the submersible. It looks directly at her, the way she looked into the camera. Unashamed, the doctor had said. An accusation, but admiration too. Unashamed, the giant squid reaches out its tentacles to her. It takes the submersible in its many arms. Augustine, delicious Augustine, its giant eye says to her, the rest of life is in the sea. There is, too, a second person perspective that runs through the book. That's also a kind of, I imagined it as a kind of direct address from me to my imagined Geneviève, who's based on Geneviève Bazil-Legrand, another celebrated patient who felt herself to be connected to Joan of the Angels, a 17th century Ursuline nun suspected of witchcraft, who had grown up in Genevieve's hometown. And this is just a tiny little section. You can't remember them all, the various stages of hysteria. Ecstasy, though, you know by heart. You've never not known it. The pose blurs your face, plumps your lips, ungrims the line of your mouth. Your hands clasped in prayer, you look up in the air, but you are here on the ground, filling your body like a sail. The photograph makes a body out of your godly imagination. Your inclination to ecstasy was your ticket out of the ragged stench of the room full of other women. You were chosen by the doctors, lifted up, slipped between clean sheets in a private room with a window you can open or close. Surely, they thought, everyone would want the sort of quiet space in which one's thoughts might wander. Where did your thoughts go? As I mentioned, there are case notes scattered throughout the book also, and it's kind of funny, but kind of not. The fact that my imagination has dragged me to France a lot, and my French has not really improved. But I took the liberty of kind of roughly translating some of the case notes. This one is not translated by me. It's translated by Asti Hustvedt in her very wonderful and terrifying and a wonderful resource book, Medical Muses. So these are case notes from the medical compendium that Charcot and his guys put together. Case notes, 1878. We used the point of a stylus to trace the name of the patient on her chest and on her abdomen. We traced the word Salpêtrière. This produced a red stripe that was several centimeters high, and on this band, the letters appeared in relief, about 2 millimeters wide. Little by little, the redness disappeared, but the letters persisted. We write the name of the patient with the point of a pin across the upper part of her chest, the word August on each leg, and Salpêtrière on her abdomen. A quite large reddened stripe develops promptly, then the letters appear in relief. W hid in the gardens until 11 at night. And this is the final section I'll read before Emily and I begin to chat. And it's called Bodies, We Are in Them. Or maybe in the before, we lived by the coast and swam in the sounding sea. We swam in the sea and there were rocks underfoot and birds overhead. These bodies, we were in them and they were in the sea. There were days, seconds, when the difference between these bodies and the sea went away. The light on the water and the wave and the next wave always coming. When we staggered out of the waves, the sand sucked at our ankles, sucking us down. The water didn't want to leave us. Its salt clings to us still. Sometimes a door swings open and an eye breaks free. An eye who walked in the night from the factory to the dormitory where she once lived. An eye so small before the moon, while in the forest, the trees grow bigger. The moon grows too. I am small, but I make enormous soul-sized shadows on the road. Her loneliness, her shadow. Here in the blurry dark, I take shape. I return, my loneliness, my shadow. Then I'm gone, same as those from the before who may or may not still be living in the world of regular days. Mother, father, sister, brother. They appear in our dreams, and how are they not here with us in the smell of damp stone and near bodies? We wake up, and of course they are not here, but we are. The cypress tree reached toward the sun, branches bending and dividing, as joyous as we were at being in the water and becoming light flashing on its surface. No, even then we knew it was not joy the trees felt. It was something better. To be a tree was to be without the burden of joy, which gives way eventually, we would learn soon enough, to nostalgia. To be a tree, to lean in the direction of the sun, not in order to forget, but because that is simply what you were meant to do. In the winter, the world shrank to a cold dot of light. The stripped tree branches carved lines into the sky as full of yearning as when they leaned into the summer sun, but not yearning at all. We will never understand. Whatever season, nature goes about its business when we aren't looking. Its magnificence doesn't need us to look.
My goodness, thank you so much, Maud, for that extraordinary reading. It's so nice to hear such a cross-section of the novel and such a range of the different things that are happening in it. I have questions.
I thought you might.
Yes. And actually, I mean, I guess what I'd like to start with is to ask you to circle, back around a little bit to talk about the process of the book's creation. So you had spoken to the origins of the project, sort of the things that brought it, to your attention and some kind of key moments in terms of putting it together. But, one thing that, I saw the manuscript at different stages, and there are some things, that I'm really interested in how the book came to its final form, including, I think the case notes were quite a late addition, and the question of kind of which of the photographs you were going to include, and integrating the different found materials into the book. So I wonder if you would talk about, sort of the later stages of the process.
Sure. I mean, it's always strange because to think about how a book comes into being, particularly a book that has many pieces, because I think it's sort of like as soon as I get to the thing in my hand, I have to forget the pain of figuring out how it got together. But it's helpful to remember the manuscript you saw, which was in fact, I think, before I had decided to integrate these case notes, like the one I read about the what's called dermographism, the writing on the skin. And I think, one of the struggles I had in putting this book together was wanting to strike a balance between creating enough historical context, and then also creating enough space for for allowing these characters who I had sort of animated with the use of some of the historical facts to have a kind of mystery, and also to have moments like the one that Blanche has at the beginning, where she's thinking about just a moment standing on a jetty looking at the ocean, because I really wanted both to kind of contextualize these voices, but also not trap them by the context, and so striking that balance was really difficult. And what I arrived at, because there were these in the book, I mean, and this was largely due to Bellevue Literary Press, who was so kind of generous with helping me design the book, and also with helping me think through how I might create pages that were meant to look as if they were torn from a medical compendium. And so my rough translations of those, sometimes you'll hit a case note, and there'll be a partial sentence at the top of one page, at the top of the page, and then an incomplete sentence at the bottom. And some of them are they're kind of awful and also sort of funny too. I mean, I think, I hope, I mean, just so I think those became, you know, if it's a city, if it's like a house in a city, then those became pillars. And then the prologue came really late too. And I think the prologue happened because I wanted to have one of the eyes who emerges kind of just speak. So that felt like a good way in, a good door into this city.
Yeah, I mean, one thing, you know, that also struck me, you know, sort of on this read, you know, is that I mean, the book is fragmentary in lots of ways, you know, and I mean, you know, I think there's a kind of wonderful abruptness to when you're reading those case notes and you come to the end and it's cut off, and you know, you have this moment as a reader of disorientation. But the other thing that in a way almost seems to, you know, to kind of work, you know, if not in the opposite direction, then, you know, sort of in a contrasting direction, is there are passages that repeat. I think, if I'm right, in different voices, you know, so there's passages of lyrical language that you find early in the book, and then they come back later on. And that was another thing I was really interested in asking, you know, kind of how, you know, how that repetition came to be, and also, you know, sort of how you envision it as part of this, you know, this novel, where the form is so disparate in so many ways.
I mean, it's wonderful to have you be such a careful reader, because of course you are, and to notice those things, because those are patterns that when I was first writing the book, I discovered them kind of in revising and revising and revising and reading and reading and reading through the sections. And then I would notice, oh, here is the C again. Oh, here is the sounding C again. Oh, here it is again. And then I was able to kind of, you know, sort of turn up the heat on those moments, so they became a kind of pattern that I could teach the reader. And so it took a really long time to figure out kind of what were the things that were repeating, and then how to kind of distill that down. I mean, I felt like it was like I was having to kind of pestle enormous amounts of research and just, you know, and sort of figure out like what was the oil that I could use. So yeah.
It's really, I mean, it's fascinating to hear about the process, you know, and you know, and also familiar, right? I think, you know, that there is that way in which the sort of focuses of a project, you know, they come into focus over time, right? And through revision, and there's sort of no other way to do it.
Well, I mean, I think this is one of the things that, I mean, every time I sit down to write a novel, I think, first of all, I think, what am I doing? And then I think, how do you do this? Like, how does this even happen? And then the only thing I know is that I can trust my instincts. And so then when I return to the draft and return to it again, I'm just looking for stuff that came from my mind that I didn't even know was in the draft. And so there was that process too, this kind of just, you know, it was both deliberate and a bunch of crashing around. I mean, you know how this goes. Yeah.
Yes.
So yeah.
I also, I mean, this is a slightly different direction, but I also had wanted to ask you maybe to elaborate on something you address a little bit, which has to do with the relationship of fiction and history. You know, and you know, the sense of, you know, that you have, I mean, both about this project, but maybe also, you know, if you could speak about fiction more generally. You know, so how do you think about that relation? Did it change over the course of this project? And, you know, I mean, one way to put this question might be, you know, sort of what are the obligations of fiction, if any, to the history that it sets out to represent?
Well, I think my ideas about this have sort of evolved and shifted over time, and one way I can speak to this is by describing a variety of historical fiction that I feel I've been very drawn to in recent years, certainly with my last book. And I can point to two contemporary novels that do this quite well. One of them is Versailles by Catherine Davis, which is, you could say it's about Marie Antoinette, but it's narrated from the perspective of Marie Antoinette's soul. And Catherine Davis, famous to me, said in response to a question about her book, you know, like, she bristled at the idea that it was historical fiction, but then in the next breath, she said, every single fact is true. If it's in the novel, like, all the facts are true. And then there's another book called The Book of Salt by Monique Trong, which is in which she has taken from the Alice B. Toklas cookbook a sort of a line about Vietnamese chefs who cooked for Gertrude Stein and Alice B. Toklas in Paris, and invented a narrator who is quite amazing and who makes Stein and Toklas look completely kind of conventional in a way. And so I mean, I point to these two books in part because, you know, I think historical fiction, it's a big tent, and there's the historical fiction. There, you know, on one end is sort of historical fiction that's kind of a mirror, that's sort of attempting to reflect a period in a time, and on the end where I find myself often is the variety of historical fiction where there are largely imagined characters who are kind of inserted into an historical context. And I mean, that question of obligation, I mean, I think for me, fiction can provide a kind of secret history that runs alongside the history we know. I mean, and at this point, we all know history to be stories as well. So I mean, I think for me, what excites me is this idea of discovering the feeling of a time, and also of I mean, I think with this book in particular, I found myself, in that direct address, this kind of impossible conversation, the feeling of, I want to connect with Geneviève. I cannot connect with her. I feel a kind of solidarity with her, but what do I know? And so I hope to kind of feature that a bit in the book also. And then find ways to kind of like bust my ideas of these women out of like their historical jails. So I think I've dodged the question of obligation, and I might actually do something especially dodgy, which is to sort of ask you back, because you also in your wonderful novel, The Last Summer of the World, and I know you are also continuing to work in this vein. Took up Edward Steichen, the American photographer, and so I wonder what your thoughts are about it. I mean, we've had conversations about it, so I'm always interested to know what you think.
Yeah, I mean, I think I mean, in a way, I don't think you judged the question at all, first of all.
Okay.
But also, I mean, I think, that it's a problem that each book solves for itself. I mean, and I think you encapsulated this idea of, the relationship of fiction to history is this real range. And so I guess if I had to answer my own question, which now I guess I do, I would say the obligation is to teach the reader what the relationship is, right? Which, I think, like this book really, I mean, through the inclusion of the found material, through the voice, and the kind of many things the voice is doing, but especially its different forms of lyricism, like I think when you read this book, you really understand kind of very clearly, sort of where the imagination has been given space, and where the facts of history are kind of there, as as part of the novel, as guideposts, sort of however you would think about them, and that that beyond that you don't really the obligation is maybe to make the relationship clear, right? And so you can have something. I mean, this is also, sort of a variety of fiction that I love. You could have something like Hilary Mantel's Tudor novels, where the details are so, sort of rich, and it does seem as though, sort of you're put in this kind of remarkable touch with the period. Or you can have something like Thomas Pynchon's historical fiction, which announces its own, sort of wild, like, diversion. So, so I think that's how I would say that, is the obligation is somehow to communicate that relationship. But I mean, the other thing that your answer put me in mind of, is, when you write in a historical mode, you're in some kind of conversation with the past, but you're also then in conversation with the moment of the book's creation. And one thing that really struck me, kind of remarkably as I was reading this, is how many things about the situation of the hysterics, and in particular, the way in which they're photographed, the way in which they're kind of required to perform themselves and their condition. One of the descriptions in the book is photographs of like different parts of their bodies, right? And the fact that, that they're sort of surrounded by these images of themselves. And that, among other things, seemed to really prefigure the kind of, like certain practices, certain kind of directions of culture, and particularly culture in regards to femininity, that were kind of to come in the century after this, and sort of even into our own time, which is a long-winded way of warming up to ask you how you were thinking about the present, and whether you were thinking about the present, sort of, and what the book might want to say to our, strange moment.
Well, there's, I mean, I mean, I liked very much how you described with historical fiction, there's always the featuring of sort of one's own perch in the contemporary contemporary moment. And I mean, there's so many ways that I think this book is sort of this moment. And I mean, so I feel like there's a million things I could say, and so I want to pick a very few things. And one of the things I was thinking about a lot was actually very recently was the Free Britney movement, the Free Britney Spears movement, that would release her from the conservatorship of from her father, that was both of her music and herself. And you know, I mean, she seems wonderful. Her music is not my favorite, but that documentary, I was completely gripped, because there was both the sort of endless scrutiny, suspicion of her in relation to her children, in relation to her body, in relation to her ever-changing body, which was being kind of constantly documented. And then there was her own performance. I don't know how many people have seen the documentary, but there was a moment where she goes and she cuts off all her hair, and she is looking kind of directly at the camera, you know, which she can never avoid. I mean, that's celebrity culture. But I did feel echoes of that. I mean, it's strange too to kind of think of, you know, there in the Salpêtrière, there were images all around, but now we live in a world. I mean, do I even have to say it? I mean, everywhere. And so there's this sense of, you know, performance. But I guess one of the things that, another thing I wanted to touch on, because I feel like this question, I feel like I want to talk about it forever, but I also want to be very specific. One of the thinkers on the subject of diagnosis and its history and the philosophy surrounding diagnoses, and someone who thinks a lot about kind of what is pathologized, how are things pathologized, is Ian Hacking. And he, not so long ago, when the most recent diagnostic manual, the DSM-5, was issued, and there was a big argument around, you know, what is this, and you know, why is it that there's this kind of attempt to put psychiatry forth as a hard science, when it was never a hard science. It was always a social science, behavioral science, and there was this way in which psychiatry in its early days kind of fronted as a hard science, in order to kind of gain traction. And Hacking wrote at that time, which was not so long ago, when the DSM-5 was issued, an op-ed for the London Review of Books, in which he described the DSM-5 as getting the very nature of things wrong. And there was something about that really struck me in terms of, you know, the 19th century that I was looking at, and that this book is drenched in, was a time of endless looking and endless kind of looking at surfaces. Forensic photography had recently come into being, and so there were endless photographs being taken, not only of women but of criminals, the mugshot of people of color, in order to kind of prove evidence of racial inferiority. I mean, I think, you know, what happens today is just maybe a little less transparent. You know, I mean, I think we often, with a lot of arrogance, kind of imagine ourselves to have evolved so much from those early days of psychiatry. But I'm sure years from now, people will look back on us and think, what in the world? So that's kind of rambly answer to your wonderful question.
That was a great answer. I mean, it just, you know, one of the feelings I came away from this book with was just like, we are it makes you feel like we're the inheritors of this regime in some
Yeah.
sense, you know, and
Well, we're drenched in it.
yeah.
We're drenched in it.
Yeah.
You know, we can't extricate ourselves from it. I mean, I think, you know, we see more, perhaps. We're more aware of it.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it's hard to get outside of it.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
I would like to ask you one more question, which goes in a slightly different direction, you know, which is one of the aspects of this book, and one of the aspects of your work that I have always really loved and admired, is, you know, while it takes on these extraordinarily serious subjects, it's also extremely funny. And, you know, and the wittiness and the humor, you know, is so much, I mean, but, you know, it's both something which you wouldn't necessarily anticipate encountering in a project on this subject, but also seems to me like completely vital to what the book is doing. And I wonder if you would talk a little bit about how you see humor working in the book.
Well, first, I just want to drink in this wonderful compliment. Because I mean, I find humor in it, and it does feel vital, but I'm not always sure that my humor translates. But I mean, I think for me, humor was akin to that moment when Blanche is looking out at the jetty, at the water, falling on the water. It's life. It's kind of, it's very, it's like the texture of a mind at work and rubbing itself against the world, and rubbing itself against the world, a world that is, you know, wants to beat it down, but the mind is saying, no, no, there's some other stuff too. And I'm going to push back. And one of the ways I can push back is through humor. I mean, I think, you know, absurdity, like that's I think where the humor here lives, and absurdity is of course the flip side of tragedy and despair. But if you lean into absurdity, then things lift a little. So I think for me it was important in the same way, kind of finding a way to render pleasure was important in the midst of all of this junk.
Yeah. I mean, it definitely strikes me that often the doctors are the object of the joke, you know, and that you know that they're, you know, and the kind of extremes of what they're doing really don't get away, you know, they don't get away with it.
Well, one of the things, I mean, this came from the research. There's a wonderful book by Christopher Getz called that's edited, and a collection of the Tuesday lessons transcribed. So they're transcripts basically. And Augustine, at one point, you know, she's in the amphitheater with Charcot, and Charcot is kind of putting her through her paces. And there's room in there for unscripted stuff. And she says to him, "Get rid of the snake in your pants." I mean, like, how is that not just a brilliant kind of like, take this? So, I mean, you know, it's funny.
Yeah.
It's funny.
So I think we should move now to questions, if others have questions, others who are not me.
There's also wine. If there are no questions, we can go directly to wine.
Anyone watching on the live stream can also drop a comment if you want to.
I have a question, I guess, because we talked about the Garza reading, and you mentioned her briefly here as well. And she has a distinction between historical fiction and documentary fiction. You discuss your work as in form of documentary fiction or in form of historical fiction, although it does contain all these documents. So how do you navigate that with this?
You mean in terms of kind of identifying it, or in terms of putting it?
Yeah, because I mean, the way she talked about was she was like talking about documentary fiction as something you're writing towards the document.
Yeah.
Historical fiction, you use it. So how do you, yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, I was so excited to read those essays, and to find that distinction she makes, because the way I understand it is that she's making the distinction between historical fiction that kind of absorbs the facts and features less the perch of the author in the contemporary world, and documentary fiction where the kind of material of the archive is present and sort of is the way in which the author has kind of worked with the archive, been in the archive, and brought things back from the archive to create kind of detours, interruptions, moments of pause, moments of kind of tension and echo. And so when I heard that articulated by her, I was like, oh, yeah, that's what I hope I'm doing. And it's a method that I really appreciate. And it helped me, I think, because I didn't want to speak on behalf of these women and these girls. That was not my place, nor was it possible. And so this was a way of kind of providing context, but also saying, here is this thing, you can look at this too, reader. And that melancholy too that she speaks of in terms of like working with the archive, like you can't bring these people back. So I think that bringing that into the mix what felt important to me too. Yeah. Josh?
Hi. As I'm reading this wonderful book, I keep thinking of Desserteau's comment that haunted places are the only ones that people can live in. And I'm wondering if you think of historical fiction as a way of being haunted by the past. Do you think of this as seance-like work? And do you think about the work of fiction as restorative of the uncanny of what you know in your wonderful book on the art mystery or of not knowing, of the unknown in some sense of the ghostly or the spectral or something like that?
Yeah, ghostly, spectral, yes to that. And also, I mean, I think the idea, I mean, mystery for me is what fiction can do. Like it's our gift. It's the gift it gives us in so many ways. The mystery of inimitable consciousnesses. And so in relation to this book, I feel like there is a kind of haunting. The seance, I mean, I feel like it's sort of a failed seance, but like the failure is part of the deal. Like again, like I can't bring these women back. I can only try. And I know I will fail. And that failure, but that attempt is also, I hope, part of what the reader receives. So yeah. No, I really appreciate the question because that idea of like unfixing what the doctors have fixed, undoing what the doctors have done, unknotting what the doctors have knotted, that really was a guiding force. I mean, throughout my mantra was really like atmospheric, not corrective. And that I think has to do with a kind of ghostly hauntingness. Yeah. Sarah.
Yeah. So great to listen to you just pull everybody on the page. And sort of to go off of Josh's question, I mean, one of the things that the effect after I finished the book of there's so much escape in the voices. There's the river and the sea and the sense of the summoning of the women's voices, and then I could just the way in which the actual mechanisms, I mean, the documents stopped over and over. I mean, there's that machinery to clamp down on their heads while they're being subdued, and that immediately is following some, the excursion that you're giving us in your voices. So I mean, I'm really thinking so much about this idea of documentary fiction, and so it is actually not only the sort of the doctors in there, but it's creating yet another space where you're seeing both the escape and then the world. And so it's creating this really powerful, or it for me, really powerful, like third room of whatever was happening, in there.
I really, really appreciate that. I mean, as Emily mentioned, I mean, the document, including the illustrations, I mean, there's illustrations both of a session of hypnosis and then also of something called an ovarian compression belt, which is something that was used to put pressure on the ovaries to stop the fits. Those really came later. They really came late in the game. And so they feel new to me too. But so to hear you describe them, that's really what I want them to feel like. To feel like, okay, here's this cage, like actually here's this belt, but there's also the escape through the mind, through the imagination, that there's imagination still at work, still possible. Yeah.
Thank you so much. That was really lovely. I have kind of a more practical question of, like, you're talking that there's the second person, the first person, there's all these different threads. How did you put them all together? I want to know. Tell me.
I threw them up in the air and then I watched them flutter to the ground. I just worked in pieces, and I think because I wrote these over the course of a lot of years, that it took a while to figure out what I was doing, and I think the Augustine sections came first. And then I started writing in relation to Geneviève, and that was really helpful because I thought, oh, right, the second person, which is sort of her, but it's also me trying to talk to her. Like that direct address felt really important. And then there's a couple of first person threads. One is Blanche, and actually one of the stories about Blanche that is true is that the diagnosis of hysteria died basically with Charcot, like he died and then it kind of faded out. But she lived on and was derided for having been a celebrated hysteric. And she found work in the radiology lab at the Salpêtrière. And then, because they didn't know anything about radiation poisoning, she lost her fingers and then her hand and then her arm. So, and yet she is also, those really are her words at the beginning. Her saying, the great doctor would say, be still. And so in the little bits and pieces we get of her through the historical documents, she was just her kind of wildness, that escape, like, came through. I mean, I can't know. I mean, it sounds, she had a really hard life, and but there also was something there that felt important to kind of carry through, and so those stories started to build. There's also a whole like history of, in some of the case notes, you begin to find like the women and girls were being given chloroform and ether and often became addicted to this stuff. I'm wandering again, but then the collective point of view came along, and suddenly I was like, oh, okay, so I've got all these different points of view, and now I'm going to build on that because I want to keep kind of circling and shifting, and I want that experience for the reader also, but I want it for myself too, just to kind of, I didn't want to ever feel totally settled or comfortable. You know.
Let's go ahead and close out with
Okay.
offering our audience and our viewers the information where they can keep up with you and find more of your work. And the same for you as well, Emily, please.
I can be found at my website, maudcasey.com. That's where I live. And I believe Emily has more information, maybe.
Gosh, I also have a website which is emilymitchellwriter.com, I think. Yes. And I'm also on Twitter. Yeah, and that's it for me. Those are the only ways.
Well, thank you both so much. This has been amazing.
Now, as Maud mentioned, there is wine
There's one.
towards the back there. So if you're of age to partake of it, please stick around, chat.
There's
grab
also
your
a little
copies.
bubbly water. So
Oh,
for
bubbly
those of
water.
you who are not drinking or of age.
We're going to use the honor system for that one. Yeah, so please stick around, chat with each other. We are open until 10 p.m. today, so you have a bit of time. And thank you all for coming out.